end of the second week.
Oh my God.
Wow.
1/3 of the program is now behind us, but a lot of the really interesting stuff is yet to come. Any questions, problems, anything we need to deal with before we plunge in?
You didn't need money.
I'm just quieting my phone here. Okay, no issues? Do you want to wait until Jennifer leaves so we can talk about her?
She's great.
Of course, it's all good. What would not be good? As I was looking through my DeLillo file, I found an old advertisement that was in the Louisville Cardinal, the school newspaper, in 1994, and it's from AT&T, and it has a bunch of letters, but then if you look, you see that words are hidden in them, and the words are "know the code," which seems to me pretty appropriate for this novel. White Noise is, was written in
1985.
84, 85 it was published, but it's amazing how, even though there have been such developments since then, it's amazing how much of it I think still resonates. And I want to we have a seminar this morning and a seminar this afternoon, so what I want to do is start out by talking about how this book illustrates elements of postmodern culture and look at some particular passages, some of them quite comic, I think, where the book focuses on a kind of a somewhat satiric look at what was in its time contemporary American culture. And then I want to move on to some of the more serious thematizing of the book as it gets into questions about postmodernism and death. And we'll look pretty specifically at the last several pages, from the point where Jack goes to kill Willie Mink up until what I consider to be the novel's three endings. So that's the plan. But a couple of things about this book. It is not quite realist. It is realist in mode, but not quite realist in mimesis. There are things in it that are just a little beyond the realm of the probable. There is no Department of Hitler Studies anywhere, as far as I know. But the Department of Hitler Studies stands for some things that have gone on in the American Academy in the last several decades. Dylar is, of course, an invention, and the book is just a little bit displaced from really just about as much as satire, realistic satire usually is. I don't know of anybody who's ever taught a class in car crashes in American movies, though people get close. And I don't know of any place where there are full professors who read nothing but cereal boxes, though I find that detail hilarious. That said, I think the book gives a kind of portrait of white middle-class life in postmodern America. The title of the book is very rich and something that about which there's a great deal to say. But I think one of the things to say about this book is that it is pretty self-consciously a book about white people and the foibles of white middle-class Americans. So with that introduction, if you think of some of the elements of post-modernity that were talked about in the introduction, what are some illustrations of those things that you find here? Yes?
Consumerism.
I'm sorry?
Consumerism.
Yes. Where?
For instance, when the family go in a shopping spree to the mall.
Yes, indeed. And that's kind of a nice place to start, actually. Pages 83 through 84. One of the really important things about this is that Jack's shopping spree is a reaction to the fact that his kind of front that he puts up to the world has been challenged by one of his colleagues. Right? He meets the guy in the hardware store, right? And the guy ends up saying to him, "I think I know those shoes." This is on top of 83. What do you mean he knew these shoes? You're a different person altogether. Different in one way, Eric. You won't take offense, he said, the grin turning lascivious, rich with secret meaning. Of course not. Why would I? Promise you won't take offense. I won't take offense. You look so harmless, Jack. A big, harmless, aging, indistinct sort of guy. Well, of course, Jack has tried to establish himself as someone with a certain kind of authority and power on campus. There's a great moment when he tells us that early on someone told him he needed a little paunch, a little belly, if he was going to look like he had authority. This is a problem that I seem to have solved. But he's bulky and he wears these dark glasses and he tries to be a sort of imposing figure. But underneath he's fairly insecure, and this guy sort of sees through him. So this seems to be what triggers his shopping spree. The encounter put me in the mood to shop.
So shopping makes you feel more secure.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, and his family starts treating him with all this respect, and he's the dispenser of bakshish, right? He's sort of the Lord sending people off on errands. And what part of this gets at is what is the pleasure of shopping? The pleasure of shopping is to feel a certain kind of power, in part. One of the things that's interesting about the book is the way in which sort of meaningful experiences can be triggered by things that don't seem very meaningful. He has that moment of epiphany listening to his daughter murmur in her sleep, and then he realizes that she's Celica, Toyota Celica is what she's saying. And on one level, it shocks him, and on another level, it doesn't matter. It's the form of that piece. It doesn't matter what she's saying. But the more money I spent, let's see. We crossed from furniture to menswear, walking through cosmetics. DeLillo does these little sentences that, if you look at them twice, they'll sort of get you walking through cosmetics. It sounds like he's walking through a wall of makeup. Walking through cosmetics. Our images appeared on mirrored columns, in glassware and chrome, on TV monitors, in security rooms. Actually, if you were going to push a point here, you could say that he's recovering his sense of the Lacanian imaginary here, his sense of himself as a unified, coherent, and active subject, looking in the mirror and seeing in the mirror an image of himself as unity, right? I traded money for goods. The more money I spent, the less important it seemed. I was bigger than these sums. These sums poured off my skin like so much rain. These sums, in fact, came back to me in the form of existential credit. I felt expansive, inclined to be sweepingly generous, and told the kids to pick out their Christmas gifts here and now. I gestured in what I felt was an expansive manner. You know, he's sort of trying to play the role of expansion. There's a wonderful line here, too, by the way, where he says, a band played live muzak. You know what muzak is?
Music.
That is supposed to engineer, that is engineered, to entertain the shopper while he is buying, so that he or she stay longer and more pleasantly within the buying setting.
Right, and it's very artificial. You know, it's very much, as you say, manufactured. If you go into an elevator and there's music, that's muzak. But nobody plays live music. Muzak is a kind of artificial simulation of music. So live muzak is a kind of example of the simulacrum, the original imitating the copy. In terms of consumerism, I think we should also look briefly at the opening section, the opening passage. The vehicles here have changed, but I've been there when this is happening. My kids both went to colleges rather like the college on the hill, small, expensive liberal arts colleges. They both went on scholarship, I hasten to add. But these are the children of the rich unloading their goods. The roofs of the station wagons were loaded down with carefully secured suitcases full of light and heavy clothing, with boxes of blankets, boots and shoes, stationery and books, sheets, pillows, quilts, with rolled up rugs and sleeping bags, with bicycle skis, rucksacks, English and Western saddles, inflated rafts. The objects inside: the stereo sets, radios, personal computers, small refrigerators and table ranges, cartons of phonograph records and cassettes. Well, those are gone. It would all be MP3 players now, but the hair dryers and styling irons, the tennis rackets, soccer balls, hockey and lacrosse sticks, bows and arrows, the controlled substances, recreational illegal drugs, the birth control pills and devices, the junk food still in shopping bags, onion and garlic chips, nacho thins, peanut cream patties, waffalo's and kabooms. What great names for junk food. The dum-dum pops, the mystic mints. You know, there's always this sense in this book that things are just waiting to get a little mystical, a little weird. One of the more disturbing sights that I had seen, and now I've seen it twice, is at the other end of this. When the seniors at the college are moving out of their rooms, the stuff that is simply discarded, you know, the thousands of dollars in goods that get left so that people can, charitable organizations can pick them up. It's incredible, the level of consumption among well-to-do college students. But that also might make us look at 259. We get sort of the dark side of consumerism when Jack looks at the contents of the trash compactor. This is the detritus of a consumer society. And it's an important passage, too, in sort of anticipating DeLillo's great fat toe-breaking book, Underworld, which is about a guy who is in the business of waste management. One of DeLillo's sort of ongoing tropes is the notion of the waste produced by a post-industrial consumer society. And he actually says quite explicitly poses the question, was this the dark underside of consumer consciousness? I came across a horrible clotted mass of hair-soaked ear swabs, crushed roaches, flip-top rings, sterile pads smeared with pus and bacon fat, strands of frayed dental floss, fragments of ballpoint refills, toothpicks still displaying bits of impaled food, and so on.
That's all.
Yeah, yeah. It's kind of like that passage in White Noise where Mucho Mas, where we have that imagination of all the dirty stuff in a used car. You remember that? It's just, well, so what do we have? What else do we have? We had the live music. What else do we have that evokes the simulacrum?
Simuvac.
Simuvac. Yes. What about simuvac?
Simulated evacuation or something.
Pardon?
It is a combination of simulated evacuation.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
See.
And this again is one of these moments where the book is a little beyond realism, but page 139, right? That's quite an armband you've got there. What does simuvac mean? Sounds important. Short for simulated evacuation, a new state program they're still battling over funds for. But this evacuation isn't simulated, it's real. We know that, but we thought we could use it as a model, a form of practice. Are you saying you saw a chance to use the real event in order to rehearse the simulation? So it's precisely that reversal of the relation of original to copy that Baudrillard talks about. And of course the answer is great. We took it right into the streets. How's it going? I said. The insertion curve isn't as smooth as we would like. There's a probability excess, plus which we don't have our victims laid out where we'd want them if this was an actual simulation. Those darn victims just won't get in the right place. You know?
Look at victims.
Yeah. Anything else?
I would like to, I mean, one of the things that I also found that would reflect postmodernism. Oh, where is my tongue? Anyway, it has to do with family itself. I mean, two things that I could find under family. One is that there's this tendency of the family being the source of gossiping, in which basically everything is told. So there is this tendency of believing in media more than in senses themselves. Yeah, believing in reality. It's like they're talking about simulation as well. So
About what?
we are talking about simulation as well. So
Yeah.
it's this tendency of the family believing more on media than on the reality. That is one. The other aspect about family is this the parenthood, which is which you could say that none of the kids is from both parents.
Oh, just there is one.
One.
The youngest.
Wilder.
Oh yeah,
Wilder.
yes.
Wilder is
Okay,
their
that
child,
the
yes.
one who normally, I mean, because of his education or something like that, he basically believes in everything, so that he thinks abstractly.
No,
But-
No, the
that's
youngest
Heinrich.
one.
Wilder is the little one.
2 years.
The
just
2-year-old.
That's
The infant.
Oh yeah, no.
He's their kid.
Yeah, but basically it is this. So we see that compared to the past, where the family was really believed as being what you'd say,
Just
the basic unit of a society. Currently, we see that is being questioned. So
Absolutely.
it is being
Yeah.
questioned.
Yeah, just a couple of notes on that. One is another example of this kind of simulation that involves specifically putting the media first. is how the girls keep developing the symptoms that come on the radio. You know, they're told that they're supposed to have vertigo and nausea, and they have vertigo and nausea, and
And
then
that
they're told
plane
now they're
incident-
supposed to have.
And that plane incident where she says that if it's not on the TV, what's the use of having all that? That plane
Yeah.
incident.
Oh yes,
When she's
yeah, exactly. But another thing about the family that you mentioned. Anyway, we were just at the passage. Let me see if I can recover it. I think it is. Let me see. It's when the family is out eating fast food together, and they get on this roll about where they get everything wrong. And I just saw it, and I'm not sure I have it. Hold on just a second.
That's when they were in that chicken.
Yeah, exactly. Let me see if I can find it.
When they are having
Yes,
it inside the car.
it's right at the beginning of chapter 17. It's pages 80 and 81. Now, there's a level on which we could argue that the family has always been a source of misinformation. Whatever misinformation you get probably begins in your family, you know. But families also are primarily known as this sort of educational force, right? So they get on this roll. What do you know about Dylar? Is that the black girl who's staying with the Stovers? No, it's the medicine, right, that's supposed to cure fear of death. Is that the black girl who's staying with the Stovers? That's Dakar, Steffi said. Dakar isn't her name, it's where she's from, Denise said. It's a country on the Ivory Coast of Africa.
No, that is different. The Ivory Coast of Africa doesn't exist, does it?
The capital is Lagos. I know that because of a surfer movie I saw once where they travel all over the world. The Perfect Wave, Heinrich said. I saw it on TV. But it isn't the perfect way.
Dissemination of misinformation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The movie is actually called The Endless Summer, but it is a movie in which they go looking for the perfect way. I happen to know this because I saw it. I don't, you know, some of the geography I don't know, but I know my surfer movie in this. But what's the girl's name, Steffi said. I don't know, Babette said, but the movie wasn't called The Perfect Wave. The Perfect Wave is what they're looking for, which is right. They go to Hawaii, Denise told Steffi, and wait for these tidal waves to come from Japan. They're called origamis. Right. And the movie was called The Long Hot Summer, her mother said. But it's called The Endless Summer. The Long Hot Summer, Heinrich said, happens to be a play by Tennessee Ernie Williams. Well, first of all, it's not Tennessee Ernie Williams. Tennessee Ernie Ford was a country singer. But also, The Long Hot Summer is by William Inge. Suddenly Last Summer is by Tennessee Williams.
So they have the whole thing mixed up.
Yeah, everything is wrong. Doesn't matter, Babette said, because you can't copyright titles anyway. If she's an African, Steffi said, I wonder if she ever rode a camel. Try an Audi Turbo. Try a Toyota Supra. What is it camels store in their humps, Babette said? Food or water? I could never get that straight. There are one-hump camels and two-hump camels, Heinrich told her, so it depends which kind you're talking about. Are you telling me a two-hump camel stores food in one hump and water in the other? The important thing about camels, he said, is that camel meat is considered a delicacy. I thought that was alligator meat, Denise said. Anyway, it just goes on. to, you know, this constant source of, or this constant list of mistakes. But I love the moment then where Heinrich says, "I'll give anyone in this car $5 if they can name the population of Bolivia." Bolivians, my daughter said. Which I think is not what he means. The family is the cradle of the world's misinformation. There must be something in family life that generates factual error, and so on. But this also relates to that sense of the loss of, or flattening of history, right? You have some vague sense of these things which you then declare to be fact, and you're wrong. It's just... I wanted to mention one more example of the simulacrum, which is the barn. Well, two more. One is that on 89 there's a Moorish theater that is now a mosque. And of course what this is a movie theater that was built in the Moorish style as a kind of, you know, just rip-off of Moorish culture. But now it's a mosque. So the copy is made into the original in this case. But the other one is the most photographed barn in America. Murray is a very important character in this book, I think. He, at times, he's just sort of over the top, you know, silly. But he's really very insightful from the perspective of someone who is thoroughly committed to the postmodernism of play. But he's the one, when they go to the barn, he looks at it and he sees what's going on, and he has the perfect analysis. He says, nobody sees the barn. You can't see the barn anymore, because when you look at the barn, what you see is the pictures of the barn that you've always seen. So it's the most photographed barn in America, which means you have to go there and take a photograph. It's like everybody who goes to the Louvre has to take a picture of the Mona Lisa, even though you can't get close enough to get a good picture, and they have wonderful postcards of it and so forth. And you know, you're likely to get the backs of a lot of heads in your picture, but you have to take your own picture of it. The Mona Lisa is one of those artworks that can really look like a copy of its copies. It's, as Benjamin talks about, how in an age of mechanical reproduction, artworks lose their aura. The aura around the Mona Lisa, it seems to me, is largely the aura of tourism more than the aura of art these days. We all take pictures of it because we know it's famous. Okay. Yeah.
I have a printed version of the Mona Lisa in Barahona, that's in the Dominican Republic, and I put it in a very beautiful frame, and it looks perfect. I mean, if I ever go to Paris, I don't think I'm going to buy a Mona Lisa. I don't need that.
Well,
That
you
only
already
cost
have
like less than $2, I guess. I mean, then the frame was the expensive thing was the frame.
Well, I will say that the first time I saw the Mona Lisa, I had this reaction that it just looked like all the copies. And then they cleaned it, and it really did look a little, you know, more. I could see it a little more as a painting, but still. Well, the other thing is, this is in a museum full of masterpieces, and you walk through the museum, and there's 3 people in front of each painting until you get to the Mona Lisa, and then there's 100.
And it's small, isn't it?
It's not very big.
Yeah, I expected it to be bigger. Then I thought it's
Now, the one that will surprise you that way is Michelangelo's David,
yeah.
which I think outstrips its reproductions. And part of the reason is you just can't believe how big it is. It's really an amazing.
Why do you think that Mona Lisa has become such a cult thing? Why this particular image?
I don't know that history. I'm sure that there's probably a pretty specific textual history. It would be interesting to go back to Vasari and see if he talks about that painting in Lives of the Painters. I don't know. But somewhere along the line, it got separated, and I don't know where it was. It partly has to do with people talking about the enigma of her smile. I don't think her smile is that enigmatic myself. It's a nice smile, but
If you see from any side, you can see I can smile at you and from a different side. Some people
But it
start
is said that she
the
was not
explanation,
actually smiling.
The side,
when
the
she
smile, the
painted.
look from any side you will find
She
she
doesn't
looks
smile.
at you, yeah.
Yeah.
She was not smiling, but it looks as if
you know,
she is.
you can do that with some paintings where you move and they seem to be looking at you wherever you are. But it's very simple. The paintings in which that is the case are the paintings that are painted with the eyes looking directly out of the canvas. And if they're that way, they will look like they're looking at you from wherever you are. But I think part of what happens with the Mona Lisa is that people know they're supposed to value it, but they don't exactly,
No, why?
they don't exactly value painting as painting, so they sort of make up stories about it. You know, oh, it's a great painting because we don't know why she's smiling.
And the story about who this actually lady could have been. Some people say this is not a lady at all; it's a man, and
Yeah.
all those
Uh-huh.
things.
It's the Vinci.
I think it's probably Madonna.
How famous was this book, the Da Vinci Code, Dan Brown here?
Oh, very, very,
In
very.
India, oh, it was.
Very, very.
In
Yeah.
Slovakia as
In
well.
Pakistan as well.
Well, the Da Vinci Code, just to get off the subject for a minute, the Da Vinci Code is a book with a pretty gripping plot.
Yeah.
Yes.
Lots of nonsense about history. But I have to tell you that it is the most poorly written novel I have ever read in my life. It is, his command of the English sentence is almost non-existent. I mean, there are sentences in that book that are howlingly bad. That's not what it's for, you know, and he's not claiming to be a great literary figure, but it is embarrassingly badly written. It just, it's a book, you know, sometimes you think, well, you could give a book like that to students just because the plot would keep them going and so forth, and there are books like that, but I wouldn't give him that one just because it just lacks command of the language. On the other hand, you know, he has command of the dollar. Well, what other elements do we see? Postmodern, examples of the postmodern.
The dig at the academic world establishing this simulacra, you know, when they actually teach the facetious things.
When they teach what?
They teach, as it just said, they teach seemingly such facetious things. I mean, some so unimportant things as wrappers and, you know, wrappers of things and how such a lot is made out of that, as if, you know, it's settled in academia that there are classes on it, there are courses on it, there are students, there are lectures.
Yes.
The whole rigmarole of it.
Yes.
On, I mean, things which do not have substance.
Well, that's a really interesting question, is about whether they have substance or what kind of substance they have. As one who teaches Hollywood movies, I would argue that there's a lot to teach there. I would not argue that they have the lasting complexity and interest of a great work of art, but I would argue that they are complex sign systems that reveal the culture. Now, I wouldn't go quite so far in terms of cereal boxes.
Yeah.
Although I can actually imagine a pretty good article on cereal boxes. And I'll tell you who would write it, would be Dennis Hall. Dennis Hall writes stuff about seemingly trivial aspects of popular culture, and they're interesting and insightful, and it's because of the application of a method. basically, you know, what happened to all this was semiotics. And once we had semiotics, and once we got things like, is it Barthes or Foucault? I think it's Foucault who says at one point a menu is as good as a myth, but it may be Roland Barthes. The notion that you can bring the method to any text and it will reveal stuff, right? Then it became much harder to say that we shouldn't study these things. You know, Roland Barthes, one of his great essays is on professional wrestling. And it's not because of the importance of professional wrestling so much as because of the importance of a method that can read culture that way. But nonetheless, this book does parody this tendency. And along with that, it seems to me, it very much parodies the flattening of history and significance by invoking the Hitler-Elvis business. Excuse me just a moment. I'll be right with you. Okay, I don't think that's a call I have to answer right now. Every now and then, I feel like maybe the staff is calling me, and I have to check. But you know, and part of the parody here is of the whole academic structure, and there's that great passage where Murray says that he wants to do with Elvis what Jack has done with Hitler.
There's like debate over that, between the two of them.
Page 11, what kind of lectures do you plan giving? That's exactly what I want to talk to you about. He said, you've established a wonderful thing here with Hitler. That's one of those hilarious sentences when you think about it. Hitler as a wonderful thing, right? But what he means is the academic study of Hitler, and it's interesting, this is all about Jack's success in academic politics. You created it, you nurtured it, you made it your own. Nobody on the faculty of any college or university in this part of the country can so much as utter the word Hitler without a nod in your direction, literally or metaphorically, which is also funny. Everybody says Hitler and nods at Jack, right? This is the center, the unquestioned source. He is now your Hitler. Gladney's Hitler. What a possession. It must be deeply satisfying for you. The college is internationally known as a result of Hitler studies. It has an identity, a sense of achievement. You've evolved an entire system around this figure, a structure with countless substructures and interrelated fields of study, a history within history. I marvel at the effort. It was masterful, shrewd, and stunningly preemptive. It's what I want to do with Elvis, who is the subject of today's necktie. This is an Elvis Presley Heartbreak Hotel necktie. The street sign says Lonely Street. And I also like this tie with this book because this little dark figure crossing the street reminds me of Willie Mink. But then there's this moment of team teaching where Jack goes in to sort of lend his weight to Murray's class, and they start teaching about Hitler and Elvis together. Let's look at that passage for a minute. It's page 70 I'm following. So what's the substance of the academic lesson here?
Relation between Elvis, Hitler, and their
mothers, their mothers,
Right.
and
Right.
the death of their mothers, death of the death of both their mothers.
Establishing a parallelism.
Yes. What else?
It seems to me the influence of Hitler's mother on his future life, on the way what person he will become. She influenced his life, and it is written here that this lady formed this person in some way, Hitler, his character.
Mhm. Now, what difference does it make that we're hearing the same things about Elvis at the same time?
Like trivializing Hitler, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that one way of reading the lesson about Hitler here is as gossip.
Mm.
You know, there's a kind of psychoanalysis here that is pretty undisciplined. I mean, really, to do psychoanalysis, you need to know a little more.
But
Yeah.
it shows that the relationship between these two men and their mothers affected their life. It created some pathology in their adulthood.
Yes. I guess I think that, I guess it seems to me that as an explanation of history, the relation between Hitler and his mother seems a little trivial. Even though I understand and believe probably more than I should have in psychoanalytic theory, to use Hitler's being a mama's boy to explain Nazism. I mean, there are lots of mama's boys. How does? But the other part of it, of course, is that for long stretches of the chapter, Hitler and Elvis are seen as equivalent figures. So it seems to me to partake of some of that stuff about the flattening of history that Jameson talked about. I don't mean that there couldn't be a good psychoanalytic book about Hitler. Maybe there could. I don't know. I don't know if we know enough or not. But in this teaching, it seems to me all about sort of captivating undergraduates with an interesting story and not about, you know, the substance of history, I guess.
Looks like it's more material for a magazine, what they have it. Not really real study, not really academic.
I agree, yes.
Maybe in some way we talked about the postmodernism of resistance when they try to make the authors try to make their variant of history. Maybe in this way it's some kind of satiric way, but he tries, Delila tries to make his variant of history concerns Hitler and Elvis. Resist the historical variant which is offered by standard variant, and he tries to change it some way in satirical way, but
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I would think that the resistance here finally would be the resistance to the trivialization of history. So that the satire is of rewritings of history that lack substance. Would that work? Yes.
Yeah. It could also be this pastiche kind of a thing. You know, one of the important rules of comparison is that comparison can be done only between comparables. But you pick up anything from anywhere and juxtapose it with anything. Anything goes with anything.
Yes.
So this whole thing of that is the incongruity, but it is as if it doesn't seem incongruous, and it is established in a lecture, in a classroom.
And I think part of it is it's making Hitler a celebrity, not a historical figure so much as a famous person about whose private life we want to know, and so forth. Maria, what were you going to say? Sorry.
I forgot. I just wanted to comment on something. It will come.
I'm sorry. I should have let you go before I blabbed. But that's part of it, is that the notion that what's important is celebrity. Hitler and Elvis can be compared because they're both celebrities, not because they have comparable historical importance. There's no measuring of historical importance here.
But what I have seen here is that somehow in the postmodern world, when someone has like a new approach on something and then makes it his own, and he actually makes like a transcendental thing out of it. The sort of thing that, for example, Ray Kroc did with McDonald's. Like, you endorse it, and then you make it your own, and then you become the protagonist. And somehow, I mean, it becomes something that people believe in, people consume.
Well, that's interesting. It seems to me that that was part of the success of Titanic.
Mm-hmm.
Was that Titanic had two stories going on. One was the story of the ship, and the other was a very carefully constructed story of the movie. Was the movie going to sink like the ship? The movie, you know, ran over budget and was much delayed, and there were comparisons in the press to Cameron as captain of the Titanic. And I think he actually did a lot to construct these stories so that there was this second narrative going on of, will the movie succeed? Will it stay afloat? And then, of course, when it was so successful, you had that happy ending along with the other story. Couple of other elements that might be worth looking at. One thing that I think is very much worth looking at, actually, as a general disposition of this text, is that there are places where it's clearly critical of postmodernity, but other places where it's, to me, fully ambivalent. One of these we might look at, if I can find the note, is about the supermarket. Actually, I don't see the page number there, but you know, Murray sees the supermarket as this place full of information and full of stimulation, and you know, and it's interesting how Murray can read certain things as much more positive than we might think. We could look at the car crashes. This is 217 and 218. How is your car crash seminar progressing? We've looked at hundreds of crash sequences. Cars with cars, cars with trucks, trucks with buses, motorcycles with cars, cars with helicopters, trucks with trucks. My students think these movies are prophetic. They mark the suicide wish of technology, the drive to suicide, the hurtling rush to suicide. What do you say to them? These are mainly B movies, TV movies, rural drive-in movies. I tell my students not to look for apocalypse in such places. I see these car crashes as part of a long tradition of American optimism. They are positive events full of the old can-do spirit. Each car crash is meant to be better than the last. There is a constant upgrading of tools and skills, a meeting of challenges. A director says, I need this flatbed truck to do a mid-air double somersault that produces an orange ball of fire with a 36-foot diameter, which the cinematographer will use to light the scene. I tell my students if they want to bring technology into it, they have to take this into account, his tendency toward grandiose dreams, toward pursuing a dream. You know, there's a funny sense in which, especially when you're talking about B movies, where all you're doing is producing spectacle here. There's a funny sense in which the production of better and better spectacles is a kind of expression of that. Yeah, we can do it. Yeah, that was pretty cool, but we can do twice that.
These car crashes remind me of the sculptures we have seen in the museum. Not the sculptures, I mean the cars that.
Yeah, the crushed cars. Yeah, that's interesting too. Yeah. Yeah, the sculptures could have been made from the results of some of those car crashes, I guess.
Sir.
Yes.
Excuse me. Isn't the writer underscoring the lethality of technological civilization?
The what?
I mean the death wish that is inherent in technology.
See, what I would say is that he's offering two contrary views. on the one hand, that view, which is the view the students take. On the other hand, Murray says this isn't the death wish of technology. This is play. This is fun. This is, you know, the production of a spectacle. It's not to be taken so negatively. And what I want to argue about the book is that there's a lot of ambivalence. There's clearly a lot of stuff that is just criticized. But when Murray talks about TV, you know, he talks about getting over your sort of nausea with it and then giving way to it. I wish I don't seem to have that. Let me see if I have it marked.
I think that he has said appetite for immortality and something.
Says what? Say again.
About TV, he says something about TV.
Yes.
It's appetite for
This is also
immortality
interesting.
and extinction.
I
or
tell
something
them
like this.
they can't think.
Oh, here it is.
It's violent. It's
51 is the passage I was looking for, and this may be the same one you were thinking of.
51?
Yeah.
51.
We start at the bottom of 50. He says,
Television.
TV is a problem only if you've forgotten how to look and listen. My students and I discuss this all the time. They're beginning to feel they ought to turn against the medium, exactly as an earlier generation turned against their parents and their country, which is interesting because it makes the medium into an ideological state apparatus, just like the family and so forth, right? I tell them they have to learn to look as children again, root out content, find the codes and messages, to use your phrase, Jack. What do they say to that? Television is just another name for junk mail. This is the students' opinion. But I tell them that I can't accept that. I tell them I've been sitting in this room for more than 2 months watching TV into the early hours, listening carefully, taking notes. A great and humbling experience, let me tell you, close to mystical. What's your conclusion? I'm skipping a little. Waves and radiation, he said, I've come to understand that the medium is a primal force in the American home. Sealed off, timeless, self-contained, self-referring. It's like a myth being born right there in our living room, like something we know in a dreamlike and preconscious way. I'm very enthused, Jack. He looked at me, still smiling in a half-sneaky way. And with Murray, you never know whether he quite means his hyperbolic attitude, but you have to learn to look. You have to open yourself to the data. TV offers incredible amounts of psychic data. It opens ancient memories of world birth. It welcomes us into the grid, the network of little buzzing dots that make up the picture pattern. There is light, there is sound. I ask my students, what more do you want? Look at the wealth of data concealed in the grid, in the bright packaging, the jingles, the slice of life commercials, the products hurtling out of darkness, the coded messages and endless repetitions like chants, like mantras. Coke is it, Coke is it, Coke is it, which is very much like what happens with Toyota Celica. It becomes almost a mantra, right? The medium practically overflows with sacred formulas if we can remember how to respond innocently and get past our irritation, weariness, and disgust. Now, I don't fully agree with Murray, although I really like television and it's gotten a lot better in the U.S. We have really interesting narratives going on television these days. But I think we should actually, if you don't mind, we'll turn directly from this to the Toyota Celica passage, which I've got to find here in my notes. Seeing it, but we're going to have to find it. Oh, there it is, 154 through 55. Now, Jack has, by this point, you know, already been exposed to the Niodine D, and he they're in a kind of emergency situation. He doesn't fully know the implications yet, but he has this moment. I'm going to begin halfway down 154, where the last paragraph on 154 begins. A random tumble of heads and dangled limbs. In these soft, warm faces was a quality. See, he's watching the children sleep. How many of you who are parents have ever just taken pleasure in watching your children sleep? When they're little, there is nothing better than when they sleep.
Yes, you have to send them to sleep.
Yes. It was a quality of trust so absolute and pure that I did not want to think it might be misplaced. There must be something somewhere large and grand and redundant, shining reliance and implicit belief. A feeling of desperate piety swept over me. It was cosmic in nature, full of yearnings and reachings. It spoke of vast distances, awesome but subtle forces. These sleeping children were like figures in an ad for the Rosicrucians, a Catholic mystical group, drawing a powerful beam of light from somewhere off the page. Steffi turned slightly, then muttered something in her sleep. It seemed important that I know what it was. In my current state, bearing the death impression of the Naiadine cloud, I was ready to search anywhere for signs and hints, intimations of odd comfort. I pulled my chair up closer. Her face in pouchy sleep might have been a structure designed solely to protect the eyes, those great, large, and apprehensive things prone to color phases and a darting alertness to a perception of distress in others. I sat there watching her. Moments later she spoke again, distinct syllables this time, not some dreamy murmur, but a language not quite of this world. I struggled to understand. I was convinced she was saying something, fitting together units of stable meaning. I watched her face, waited. 10 minutes passed. She uttered two clearly audible words, familiar and elusive at the same time, words that seemed to have a ritual meaning, part of a verbal spell or ecstatic chant. Toyota. A long moment passed before I realized this was the name of an automobile. The truth only amazed me more. The utterance was beautiful and mysterious, gold shot with looming wonder. It was like the name of an ancient power in the sky, tablet carved in cuneiform. It made me feel that something hovered. But how could this be? A simple brand name, an ordinary car. How could these near-nonsense words, murmured in a child's restless sleep, make me sense a meaning, a presence? She was only repeating some TV voice. Toyota Corolla, Toyota Celica, Toyota Cressida, supranational names, computer-generated, more or less universally pronounceable. Part of every child's brain noise, the substatic regions, too deep to probe. Whatever its source, the utterance struck me with the impact of a moment of splendid transcendence. I depend on my children for that. Now, how do you take that passage? How ironic is it, or isn't it? Yes.
It's very ironic, I think, because here the TV replaced the role of the parents in teaching and guiding. So they remember, and even in their dreams, the TV commercials more than their parents or important things in their life. So as if the TV here is just like the teacher who teaches the generation, and not the parents or not the schools. And it also manifestly clarifies, the role of the media in postmodernism.
Anything else?
There seems to be in modernist text, there is that word epiphany. And how it parodies, it seems something so important, and then ultimately it turns out to be just an another brand name.
Yeah, like all those associations with the sacred,
Yes.
saints, religion, and all this stuff. So you expect some kind of prophecy or something, but then what comes out, Toyota Celica. Oh my God.
That, the anticlimax of it all.
Anything else? Yes.
From a Freudian point of view, the child sleeping, the subconscious is awake. That subconscious is now constructed by the screen, by the TV.
And by consumerism as well.
Yes. By consumerism.
I saw another hand.
Yes,
Yes.
It's almost the same idea because the father is a figure of authority in the family, and beyond that is also the one who, I would say, the dispenser of values. And it seems that TV is in control. I mean, media is in control of the brain of a child. Then the father is only a witness of the I would say that the constructive event of media's impacting things on the brain of a child.
Fella?
I mean that there is nothing as deep as the unconscious of a child sleeping, and even there we find the automobile. So it means that the automobile industry and its industrialism has gone so far away in our unconscious.
Everything that's been said, I think, is accurate, but I think it's all one side of the passage. Because the other side of the passage is that Jack experiences this as a moment of transcendence, as something splendid.
The new
It's-
religion.
Huh?
It has become a new religion.
But I think that's one way of reading it. There's another way of reading it for me, which is that what's important is not the content. We've thought that the content was what's important, but what's important is in some sense the form. What's important is the child sleeping, uttering this melodious phrase, and in one way, for better or for worse, it doesn't matter what the phrase is. He gets a moment of splendid transcendence here. Not a moment of shock and dismay at what the poverty of my child's imagination is. And on one level, I think it is clearly satiric in exactly the ways that you have mentioned. It's anticlimactic, it's media, it's consumerism, it's all those things. But the other side of it is that there are still these experiences, and what matters is the quality of the experience, not the content of the message. At least for Jack in this moment. So there's what I think is and it may be decidable, but I tend to want to think that there is an undecidable ambivalence in this text about this world that we live in which transcendent moments are still possible, but emptied of traditional content. I actually, on one level, I think it's screamingly awful that this is what the child says. But on another level, I take Jack at his word in terms of his experience. Whatever its source, the utterance struck me with the impact of a moment of splendid transcendence. Yes?
I think that he is opposing his consciousness to the unconsciousness of his children, because he says, I depend on my children for that. And in the next paragraph he says, a deep dwelling crab-like consciousness, silent and dreamless. So it means that he has no longer an unconscious level in his personality, and he depends on his children to remind him of this part of his humanity.
That's interesting. Well, I'm going to propose first of all, I think over and over again, this book is critical of postmodernity, and I don't mean to deny that part of it. But I'm going to propose that later we come back to some of these ambivalences about it as well. One thing we should mention in terms of TV is that Murray sees it as having these sacred formulas and all that. Jack talks at one point about its narcotic undertow and eerie, diseased, brain-sucking power. So that's the other side, right? That's the critique of postmodern popular culture, really from the perspective of modernity, from someone like Adorno, right? Adorno and Horkheimer talking about how popular culture dulls the masses and makes them, subject to the dominant ideology and so on. I mean, there's a sense in which television in the 20th century is seen as replacing religion as the opiate of the masses. But there's here the suggestion that there's also something else to it, which would be nice because it would then mean that I am not having my brains sucked out when I enjoy it. I go home from a long day with you guys on this project, and I've been watching. I told you I was watching this series called Game of Thrones. I'm so disappointed because I've now seen the whole first season, and it won't be back till next spring. But, and this is partly how television has changed. Television has gotten much more interesting in terms of its serial narratives. And I think deserves at this point to be taken a lot more seriously.
But don't you think it is replacing family life and relationships? Instead of going home to someone who can, you can talk with, you go and watch TV. It's replacing all the family life that we used to have.
I think there is some of that, definitely. My wife was hardcore about this, and our children were very limited in what they could watch on TV when they were very little, and we always had dinner at the dinner table together. And that's very important stuff, and it is lost in many, many families. On the other hand, I would suggest that this is a family with a flawed but rich family life. Families at their best bring up all our sentimental attitudes. But if we really look at the quality of family life day to day, I don't think that it fits the image of family at its best. I think it's day to day, and some days you're getting along and some days you're not. Some days you're busy, and if you're like me, some days you're a little cranky with your children, and because you haven't had enough sleep, and family life is itself, it's finally a fundamental value for me, as it is for many, many people, most people I would say. But it isn't perfect, and it's not like it's, let me put it this way. People don't sit and eat their dinner in front of the television because they're bad people. They do it because the television is giving them something. I don't think that what it's giving them is as important as sitting down with your family at the table and having a discussion. Although, now that my kids are grown up, we almost always sit in front of the television. And, we do have a shared activity of television watching. And we have moments of high hilarity at our pleasure, sometimes in what's really bad on TV. I would not do that with young children. But the other thing is that's interesting about this, there's a really important thing in Jameson where he says, it's too easy simply to say this is postmodern and I'm against it. Because what he says is, this is the world. Now it may not be your world. Your world may be differently constituted. But for people like me, this is just the space I live in, and I've got to make whatever of it I will. I can't go back to an earlier time. It's not going to happen. And there are many, many things that I would not give up, that you would have to pry from my hands. You know, one thing, I'll give you one example. We have extreme medical technology. People talk about going back to an earlier era, and wouldn't that have been simpler and a better life and so on. Well, it would have been for those who lived, but I'd have been dead. I had pneumonia twice as a child. I do not believe I would have lived to be a year old before penicillin. You know, I want all the medical technology they could come up with. Similarly, you know, we complain about our cell phones, but I want my cell phone. And I'll tell you something else. My cell phone was the best thing that could have happened to me as a parent at the time it came. My kids were teenagers, and we were able to keep in touch in a much more secure way. If they had an emergency, they could get to me. If I didn't know where they were, I could get to them, you know. It's technology. They get obsessed with it. My son spends too much time worrying about cell phones. But I want mine, and I want my kids to have theirs. So, my only point is this. There's a lot that is screwed up about society in this book, and a lot that the book is clearly satirizing and criticizing. But I think it's too simple a view, both of the book and of the world it represents, to think that that's all there is. On the other hand, as I think about the specifics, it gets harder to defend them. But still. Why don't we, on that note, take a break?
Utterance.
An utterance and a sentence.
Yeah.
Well, a sentence is it's a grammatical unit, and there are certain rules about what is and is not a sentence. You've got to have a subject and a verb.
Great idea.
Capital letter and full stop.
Yeah, and in some ways, a sentence is actually a concept of writing. An utterance is anything that is said or written in a language. Right?
It's a semantic.
In terms of linguistics,
utterance is a part of linguistics or semantics.
Yeah.
We sort of, I mean, what you said is right. I mean, I've taught linguistics for some time, and utterance is basically spoken language, and the sentence is written language.
It's kind of
the written discourse versus spoken discourse.
Well, I think that's in general true, although lots of people use utterance to apply to things that are written as well, but it's sort of in some sense metaphorical. But part of the difference is that utterance has to do with, here's where that really works. People communicate only partly in sentences. We say, yeah. We say, okay. We say, please. These are not sentences. These are utterances. We say, ouch. These are utterances within a language that clearly communicate, but they do not have the grammatical standing of a sentence. And the sentence is, generally speaking, a grammatical unit whose importance is primarily in written text. Yeah. Is that fair? Does that?
Yeah, it's okay. Thank you.
Well, let's take a break. The previous ages, in many cases, presented their own set of problems. For instance, I'll give you some negative changes and some positive changes in American parenting in a postmodern world. Negative changes. The business of sitting in front of the television at dinner, the business of how little parents actually talk to their children is I think that's a negative. I really do. Although it is not part of my world. In the world of middle-class academics, parents talk a lot to their children. But I think there are a lot of things that have pushed the family away from being what we think of as a traditional site of love and closeness and so forth, and toward a consumer unit and so forth. On the other hand, as an example, we have had a tremendous shift in American attitudes toward masculinity, especially in the middle class, especially in relation to fathers' relationships with children. I was the child of a generation in which fathers were advised to keep their distance from their children, advised to be very tough on them, advised not to be very expressive of positive emotion, to withhold praise, and to be pretty harsh and strict. I am of a generation that very much reacted against that. And I was hard on my kids in some circumstances, but I was much more involved with them and much more willing to express love for them. And I saw my role in relation to them much differently from what had been seen as the traditional role. I know that I benefited from that. I think they did too. And I think that the kinds of, we debate sometimes in the States how much gain there has been as a result of feminism. I think one of the really significant gains, and it came partly through feminist critiques of traditional masculinity and feminist demands on men, is that men are more able to express emotion and more able openly to love their children. Those I see as real gains. So, in other words, on the one hand, there are things that pull apart the family and so forth, but on the other hand, there are some positive trends in the family as well. One thing that is absolutely, I think, true in the U.S. is that while most people in the U.S., like most other people in the world, live close to some of their family or whatever, we increasingly have nuclear families but not close ties to extended families. And we increasingly can end up in a situation where we are not around family. You know, I think I've mentioned, I have a first cousin who lives near Cincinnati, but I don't ever see her. I see my cousins in general once every year or two, and I'm, for the most part, not terribly interested in seeing them more than that. My children live 650, well, let's say 1,000 kilometers from me. And I expect that that will always be true, at least that they will live at least that far away. I would like to see more of them, and when I retire, I will find ways, and when if I have grandkids, which I expect I will find ways to spend time with them. But we are a mobile people, and while lots of us live our lives in the same place that we grew up, lots of us don't. In the academy, almost none of us do. And it's a different organization of living. I think I think also that it's important in every case not to get too black and white in our judgments about things. I know many godless people who are more ethically rigorous than many believers, for instance. And you know, one may, whatever one's faith is one's own business, and whatever one believes is going to happen to those godless people after death, you know, is whatever you choose to believe. But I can tell you that there are a lot of godless people who are highly ethical, and I know this because I know them. So you can't make. It's just like Americans make stupid, stereotypical judgments about Muslims. You can't make stereotypical judgments about what somebody's going to be like because they grow up in this culture. I think that there are good things about it and bad things about it.
But I was not specifically referring to the American society. This is also in my country. It's always like said that we sit in a box and we keep looking at a box. It's also happening in my country. We do not enjoy that kind of family life that used to be the case with my parents.
Uh-huh.
It's almost the same. We spend most of the time in front of the television. I was not specifically referring to the American society. I was talking in general.
Point taken, and I think that's important. I think it's hard to hear the word television and not think of American society. Although I was just saying outside that it's actually becoming a residual technology.
There are like 100 channels, and you just keep switching between them. It's the same everywhere.
Yes.
Okay, I have a question. That is, I got an impression that in some books that means only those the lower classes or the poor like watching TV every day, while those the rich and those white collar, maybe they have more other things to do. Do you think there is such kind of things?
I think a lot of white collar people watch an awful lot of TV. Yes, they have more choices for amusements, but I still think American homes are likely to have a television on.
Even in my country, there are people who do not have enough money to eat, but they have a TV in their room. It's the same in India.
But I think that because the rich have more choices, just as Professor you have mentioned, they can go to watch a baseball game, they can go to a club, or play with their friends, or a lot of choices. While the working class or the lower class, they have no other choices. When they're back home, they have to sit in front of TV and watching TV. It seems that TV has a magic power to control them, control their ideology. So they could not develop themselves. They cannot do anything else. They are just like alcohol, They are indulging in this, and they are controlled by the TV. While those who are elite or are rich in the society, they can fight against the TV. They have this strength and power. They can do something else. So maybe that's not correct, but just my impression on TV.
I think there's a grain of truth in that, but again, I think it's too simple. For one thing, lots of working class people in this country do lots of other things. They go outdoors a lot, for instance. Lots of hunting and fishing. Working class people can have social lives as well. And an awful lot of more well-to-do people go home really tired and turn on the television and have a drink. What do you think I'm doing when I go home? So in other words, I don't see people as imprisoned by the television, but I do see the media as having. On the other hand, I do see the media as having too great an influence, and I do see people as lazy in terms of what they do with their recreational time. One thing that is the case, though, is that all of this is changing in ways that people who are over 30 have trouble understanding, I think. I know people over 60 do, believe me. But my kids are constantly in front of a screen, but it's rarely the television. I mean, they watch TV, but their major recreational tool is the computer, not the television. And increasingly, for many of them, it's the phone, not the computer. And they, the whole. So things are changing in a lot of ways. And one thing about the internet is, it's full of misinformation and horrible stuff. Another thing is, you can read all kinds of stuff there, and you do more reading if your computer's on than you do if your TV's on. It's hard to say about all these things. In a general way, I am shocked by the ignorance of the populace pretty much everywhere, almost everywhere. In a specific way, I think it's, again, more complicated. And I do think that I watch a lot of TV and it doesn't hurt me. Yeah. So, yes?
Depends on what you watch.
I don't think it even depends on what I watch. I think it depends on how I watch it.
Yes.
Yeah.
But in the families, for example, in El Salvador, I had a friend that has a big slogan or motto. It says much more TV, less communication. Because what you mentioned before, families, for example, in the past used to get together and dine together, but not with TV. And now they have moved to be in front of the TV screen. And this is what is blocking the communication, and as a result, this may be one of the factors of having all these families being apart, not unified families anymore.
Television will lead to less communication between the people.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well,
and they become addicted to TV. Yeah.
That happens, but I also have to say that television helps my kids and me communicate these days because, and it did when they were teenagers. Because if we sat down and just tried to communicate, they would clam up. But if we watched TV together, we could talk about it. So it's not completely that way again. On the other hand, in general, I agree with you. I think people ought to read more books, talk more to people, and not be so stupid and not watch as much TV. So yeah. But I think that there's more to be said. That's all.
In a slightly digress, but talking about reading more books, yesterday in the reading, amongst the audience, there were more elderly people than youngsters.
We saw that.
So many of us noticed that. Now, is that this crowd, the younger crowd, they are more into at that point of time, they would be sending emails or with their computers or something and not coming to a reading session? Only the elderly people come. How do you read this?
Well, I think demographically, as Sarah Gorham said, a lot of the audience for fiction is women in their 50s and older. And Bobby Ann Mason is certainly a woman who appeals to a predominantly female audience and B, not a particularly young audience, I think. I also think that with any cultural event on a weeknight, you're likely to get a rather skewed view because more retired people might go out than people who have to get up and work in the morning. Similarly, and this is probably a bigger factor as I think about it, if you have young children at home, you have to get a babysitter to go to that reading. So a lot of the people that you see are people whose children are old enough that they can look after themselves or that they're not home anymore. So that's part of it. That said, there is some concern about the aging of the audience for the traditional arts. And that's partly because there are so many things that compete for people's leisure time. A lot of students go to readings. I mean, well, not a lot, but at some universities, a lot of students go to readings. If Bobby Ann Mason had read on this campus instead of at the public library, and if it had been during the school year, I would have expected to see some students. Not a lot, but some. I guess that's the best I can
Thank
do
you.
with that. But it is also true that the people who are going to go out to Bobby Ann Mason's readings are not the people who otherwise would be sitting at home on Facebook. They're the people who otherwise would be sitting at home
I think
watching
there would be different audience, like with Neil Gaiman or someone like that.
Sure.
Sure. Maybe because Bobby Ann Mason is a female writer, and so he has got more female readers. So
That's
they
true,
have a
although
common
the,
language, right?
although the audience for a serious male writer would probably be predominantly female as well. Women tend to read more fiction than men do.
Can I also say something about TV?
No.
Oh.
Of course.
I wanted to say something because a lot of people are like, and I think it's, partly agreeing on what you said, is what you do with it. To me, for example, TV has been very important because I did not go to high school in English. And I learned a lot of stuff, that I use in my classes. I picked it up as I watched TV, a lot. I mean, lots of documentaries, shows, biographies, you understand? I feel that is a very important medium. I mean, you just have to know how to use it. It's very educational if you use it for that purpose. And it's something that you cannot substitute, or you couldn't have substituted for it when we didn't have computers, for example.
Well, the more I think about this book, the more I think that in many ways it's an example of the anti-postmodern, that it's an example of a text that represents and criticizes many elements of postmodern culture. But I think there is an ambivalence in it, and a sense in it too of this is simply the world I live in, how do I deal with it, rather than a kind of programmatic, we must go back to modernity or something, or go back to religion or whatever. I'm going to jump the gun here, as we say, and, well, I'll do that in a minute. Just a couple of other sort of postmodern elements. There's this hilarious conversation that Jack has with Heinrich, where Heinrich won't admit that it's raining. And I think it's really funny. It's pages 22 through 24. But what's funny about it is that it illustrates the difference between a certain common sense view of the world and what we get if we think rigorously philosophically. From a rigorous philosophical position, Heinrich is right, and what Jack's frustration is, he can't win the argument. On the other hand, we all know that sometimes it rains, and we deal with that reality. But what I love about the passage is how it illustrates the difference between our common sense notions of the world and our high theoretical notions that that are in some ways that are the product of more rigorous thinking. When I think about deconstruction, for instance, on the one hand, I think that the arguments are very convincing about the sliding of signifiers and about how all texts are flawed and so forth and so on. And on the other hand, I do not want a surgeon who is a deconstructionist. I don't want someone who thinks that the liver is substitutable for the kidney, or, I don't want to take my car to a deconstructionist auto mechanic. On the other hand, I don't want to take my car to any French auto mechanic. But there is this discrepancy between common sense stuff that operates in the world and what we actually know if we think rigorously. For instance, we know finally that we cannot prove that anything that we see or experience is not an illusion. We can't prove it. You know, you could all be figments of my imagination. I can't believe my imagination would be quite that strange.
And so varied.
Huh?
And so varied. 18 different countries in your imagination.
But we are rather stereotyped. You know, if you look at us, we are rather like.
Right.
Prototypes.
On the other hand, I can get through the day pretty well believing that you're all real. But I can't prove it. And on one level, that makes no difference. And on another level, these things do make a difference. For instance, when we start thinking about the writing of history, it makes a difference for us to understand that history is not the record of fact, but rather history is a constructed narrative. Whoever tells it.
It's written.
Huh?
It's written.
Yes. And it's always selected, right? And the mere selection shapes it. And so we have to have a much more skeptical attitude toward historical utterance. And we probably need to know lots of perspectives on history because of those things. So there's a way in which it does make a practical difference. I will also say about TV, I think that one thing that has happened on TV is journalism has changed. And there used to be some sense, some widespread sense that journalists had a responsibility to facts and that they had a responsibility to be at least as objective as they could be, even though nobody can ever be thoroughly objective. It seems to me that fact and opinion have gotten much more blurred in journalism in this country, and that the responsibility to canons of rational thought has declined. And that's, to me, very troubling.
So that's common between history and journalism. Opinion with facts.
Say again?
I'm saying this is the common thing between history and journalism. Opinion mixed with facts. Opinions shaping the facts.
Yeah, but yes, and it's always true. But it seems to me also that there are ways of being more or less responsible to fact. And I think we've lost some of that in American journalism.
In Pakistan also, it's all the time we are having breaking news, and when you try to search for it, it's not that breaking news.
Yes. Oh yes, yes. And of course one thing that happens too is that all the news is hyped.
Yeah.
Because ultimately the point of most news outlets is to get people to watch. And the profession has certain ethical principles, just as teaching does, for instance. But increasingly they're under pressure to yield their ethical principles to the need to attract a market. One of the very famous notions about the news in the U.S. is, the local news in particular, is that even if important local governmental decisions are being made, a murder will be the lead story if there's a murder. You know, if it bleeds, it leads, is the expression. And then you get a very skewed notion of what's truly important. Anyway, yes.
I mean, this is one of the most, serious problems with TV and with the media, is how they broadcast a certain event. Alright, so back home when we have any event, any accident, any attack, we have lots of channels, satellite channels, so I keep switching from one channel to the other to see what's happening. There are certain satellite channels who would exaggerate, over-exaggerate a small accident, a small event, okay? The other channel would give only the opposite image because it has certain political tendencies.
Sure.
Okay. The other would just mention that accident, that event in the subtitle. Okay. So it depends on the political tendencies, you know, of that satellite channel. This is why I think media and the TV played a very important role in reinforcing this illusion of reality. So you are understanding, you are taking that event and the meaning of that event through the viewpoint of that satellite channel, okay? So they are as if they are imposing their opinion and their political tendencies on the audience. So we have a variety of these things. I'm done.
Yeah, and it's still just mediated because you don't have direct experience. So
Yeah.
you can't trust any of this, basically.
Actually, hello. There are a good number of programs in the United States which are based on gossiping, right? Like the Inside Edition and programs like that, which are based mainly, most and foremost, on gossip, rumors, right? Celebrity news and all that stuff. And this is
Trivial
also
stuff.
reflected, yes. This is, we can see this in the text. And another comment on Salih's comments, there are channels which have political agendas and which, let's take for example the Al Jazeera channel, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the Arab Revolution, then this modern revolution, if you like, you can see that Al Jazeera, for instance, has turned into an operation room, right? Stirring people and young people particularly to go out into the streets and do this and say this and revolt and don't give up. I mean, with this it gives us a good example, ample evidence of how powerful, if you like, TV is. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
I think in that light, I think Dan Brown also said, calls the media, the press, as the right arm of anarchy.
Well,
because as you watch it here, it sparks it there, and so on.
one of the problems, too, is that on the one hand, most of us would agree that what we want is an educated citizenry that is capable of forming its own opinions and capable of analyzing information and so forth and so on, right? On the other hand, it is not particularly in the interest of any state to create that citizenry. Because it's much easier to rule people who are more easily led. So there's always a tension between that goal of education and whatever powers exist, it seems to me.
Yep.
In terms of this ambivalence about the postmodern, I'm going to suggest that the book culminates in part in one large image that one very important metaphor that in some ways both summarizes that issue and makes it even more allegorically meaningful, and that's the postmodern sunset. They watch the sunset more than once. But I want to begin with the last one. This is one of the three endings, actually. I say, my argument is that after the Willie Mink scene and the scene with the nun, chapter 40 tells 3 episodes, and the 3 together go together to constitute the ending. But this is the middle one. Now, let me set this up in terms of Jameson again. You may remember that part of the argument in Jameson's piece is that nature as such doesn't quite really exist anymore. That the larger other that postmodern subjects face is not nature in any pure sense, but rather the economic order of late capitalism. And one of the interesting, in fact, images of this is simply the notion that the sunset in this text may itself be a product of the technology of late capitalism. So, if we go back to traditional notions of the sublime, well, what's the traditional notion of the sublime? Think Burke, think Rousseau, think, the sublime.
The natural order.
Literally speaking, you mean?
Yeah.
Yes.
The beauty
The
of
sublime, yes, the sublime means excellence in writing literature. It is the act of transforming, or the process of transformation, the reader from one psychological state, one mental state into the other. And it should end with a kind of an illumination, a certain understanding, a better understanding of the world and the nature as it is understood by the author.
Okay.
So it's a process more than a technique. This is my
Okay.
understanding of the sublime.
Okay. What is the experience of the sublime from which we get that model for writing? What are if you have an experience of the sublime, where and how is it paradigmatically does it happen?
When we watch natural creation.
When we're confronted with nature, right?
Yeah.
And what's the nature of the confrontation with nature that is sublime rather than beautiful? Yeah.
First, it is withheld by our sensory perception, nature. We
It is.
see. It is held by our, I mean, it comes to us through our sensory perception,
Yes.
our senses. Then it triggers an emotion. And then these two are more transient. And then it gives us a static feeling, either a buoyant static feeling or something, which, the 3 stages often described by Wordsworth, that you see, then you feel, and then it touches your soul.
Okay. Now, imagine someone wanting to have an experience of the sublime, a romantic poet. Where does that person go?
Nature.
What kind of nature?
The seashore.
Rural, pastoral nature.
The mountain or the sea.
The wilder aspects of nature.
I said the mountain, and I have a theory.
The wilder.
The wilder aspect. What about
The mountain, because I have read Mircea Eliade's The Sacred and the Profane, in which the mountain is the axis mundi. It is the axis of the world. And it is the place where a human being experiences a hierophany, which is a divine revelation.
Okay. Now, traditionally speaking, the difference between the beautiful and the sublime is that a beautiful landscape is one that is on a human scale and often one that is ordered by human activity, too. A garden or a pastoral setting. The sublime is where we are overwhelmed by nature as other. And the classic sort of paradigm for this, and here's, you can tell now why I am not an artist, is little man or little person and great big mountain, right? Which dwarfs the human and makes the human feel insignificant and overwhelmed by the scale of nature, right? And this this leads to two emotional reactions: fear and ecstasy. Right? A combination of fear and a kind of ecstatic transport, right? That is caused by nature as other in its power. Now the argument in Jameson is that the powerful other is no longer nature, but rather this system of late capitalism that we can't even get our minds around. We can't see it as we can see the mountains, for instance, right? But his notion is that nature as other has been replaced. Now, what I want to argue is that the postmodern sunset in this text is a revision of the traditional notion of the sublime into a postmodern sublime. And let me read you the passage, and we can see maybe how this works. We go to the overpass all the time, Babette Wilder and I. We take a thermos of iced tea, park the car, watch the setting sun. Oh, I'm sorry, 324. By the way, if you want to think of the sublime in painting, think of Turner and those overwhelming, colorful landscapes and seascapes. Right. Anyway, those of you who know Turner, and if you don't, they're great paintings. You'd like them, honest. We take a thermos of iced tea, park the car, watch the setting sun. Clouds are no deterrent. Clouds intensify the drama, trap and shape the light. Heavy overcasts have little effect. Light bursts through tracers and smoky arcs. Overcasts enhance the mood. We find little to say to each other. More cars arrive, parking in a line that extends down to the residential zone. People walk up the incline and onto the overpass carrying fruit and nuts, cool drinks. Mainly the middle-aged, the elderly, some with webbed beach chairs which they set out on the sidewalk. But younger couples also, arm in arm at the rail looking west. The sky takes on content, feeling, and exalted narrative life. The bands of color reach so high seem at times to separate into their constituent parts. There are turreted skies, light storms, softly falling streamers. You know, this grand sunset, right? It is hard to know how we should feel about this. Some people are scared by the sunsets, some determined to be elated, but most of us don't know how to feel or ready to go either way. Rain is no deterrent. Rain brings on graded displays, wonderful running hues. More cars arrive, people come trudging up the incline. The spirit of these warm evenings is hard to describe. There is anticipation in the air, but it is not the expectant midsummer hum of a shirt-sleeve crowd, a sandlot game with coherent precedents, a history of secure response. This waiting is introverted, uneven, almost backward and shy, tending towards silence. What else do we feel? Certainly there is awe. And awe is what the sublime produces. Awe in the sense both of fear, it is terror, and in the sense of appreciation. I am awed by it, right? It's that double emotion. It is all awe. It transcends previous categories of awe. But we don't know whether we are watching in wonder or dread. We don't know what we are watching or what it means. We don't know whether it is permanent, a level of experience to which we will gradually adjust, into which our uncertainty will eventually be absorbed, or just some atmospheric weirdness soon to pass. The collapsible chairs are yanked open, the old people sit. What is there to say? The sunsets linger, and so do we. The sky is under a spell, powerful and storied. Now and then a car actually crosses the overpass, moving slowly, deferentially. People keep coming up the incline, some in wheelchairs, twisted by disease, those who attend them bending low to push against the grade. I didn't know how many handicapped and helpless people there were in town until the warm nights brought crowds to the overpass. Cars speed beneath us coming from the west, from out of the towering light, and we watch them as if for a sign, if they carry on their painted surfaces some residue of the sunset, a barely detectable luster or film of telltale dust. Well, I'll stop there. Now, why are the sunsets like this? These are not your ordinary sunsets. Most of us don't get sunsets like this most of the time. Why are they like this?
In the novel, because of the emission of the gas.
Right. It's either the niodine D or the stuff that was put up there to eat the niodine D. We don't know which one. But you know what causes a beautiful sunset is particles in the air. It's the light reflecting off particulate matter. Sometimes it's particularly beautiful over the sea because it's coming through mist or whatever. But these are postmodern sunsets. They are sunsets produced by the economy of late capitalism. The economy that produces niodine D produces this sunset. It is not a natural phenomenon per se. And as such, it becomes, I think, an image of that thing that has replaced nature as the grand other that we can't understand. Yes.
And then in a novel so obsessed by death, it might be the symbol of death as well.
It could be. It could be, but they don't know. It may just pass. It may be a new condition of life. It may be a sign of apocalypse. It may just go away. They don't know. Yes.
This, confirms your remark. Here, technology has two faces. It's either good and comforting, or it's also threatening, right? So here, the double-facedness, if you like, of technology is cut in this image of the sunset, which has, in this town, become much more beautiful than it was, or it used to be.
But it could also be really scary.
Of course.
And in fact, we get that. It is hard to know how we should feel about this. Some people are scared by the sunsets, some determined to be elated. I take those who are determined to be elated to be the people who are completely dedicated to a postmodernism of play. Right? Those would be the people who would look at the spectacle and just say, oh wow, it's beautiful.
It's
Right?
Mona Lisa.
Huh?
It's Mona Lisa. It's beautiful because we have a predetermined notion in our mind that it is supposed to be beautiful. We're
Maybe, but
determined.
maybe it's just beautiful.
Yes.
I mean, if you've ever seen a truly spectacular sunset, which I have occasionally, like out in the mountains out west, or once over the ocean or something, there are a couple of times over the ocean. There's not much in the world that is more beautiful than a great sunset, right?
This to me is exactly the image of the postmodern world, this sunset. We have some fears for it, but we want to be part of it, we want to be in it. Though we have some fear of losing our traditional values, we do sometimes say that it's not the same anymore, but still we don't want to go away with it. We don't want to go to the earlier times. It's to me an exact image of the postmodern world.
Mm-hmm. And there are people who are scared of it, and they
Yes.
would probably like to go back to the old sunsets.
Yes.
There are other people who say, hey, bring it on, it's beautiful,
Yes.
right? Without sort of thinking about its other possible implications. But most of us, we are told, don't know how to feel. It is hard to know how we should feel about this. And in some ways, I find myself thinking that this is DeLillo telling us what his novel is about the difficulty of knowing how to feel about this very strange world that we have found ourselves in.
Perfect analysis.
Huh?
Perfect analysis.
Well, thanks. I think it's a wonderful passage that, really quite remarkable passage. Well, there's also there's another image of a great sort of almost sublime spectacle in the text. And it's not the last one, and I kind of privilege this last one as the most important. But this is one, too, where he's thematizing a difference between something old and something new. And in this case, the old is better, I think. But this also begins to open up the whole question of death in the novel. And what I'm talking about is the fire in the insane asylum, 239. This was the night the insane asylum burned down. Heinrich and I got in the car and went to watch. There were other men at the scene with their adolescent boys. Evidently, fathers and sons seek fellowship at such events. Fires help draw them closer, provide a conversational wedge. And this is, of course, also, this is the fire as spectacle on 239. There is equipment to appraise, the techniques of firemen to discuss and criticize, the manliness of firefighting, the virility of fires, one might say, suits the kind of laconic dialogue that fathers and sons can undertake without awkwardness or embarrassment. For my son and me, it's sports that does this. But most of these fires in old buildings start in the electrical wiring, Heinrich said. Faulty wiring, that's one phase you can't hang around for long without hearing. Most people don't burn to death, I said. They die of smoke inhalation. That's the other phrase, he said. Flames roared through the dormers. We stood across the street watching part of the roof give way, a tall chimney slowly fold and sink. Pumper trucks kept arriving from other towns, the men descending heavily in their rubber boots and old-fashioned hats. Hoses were manned and trained. A figure rose above the shimmering roof in the grip of a telescopic ladder. We watched the portico begin to go, a far column leaning. A woman in a fiery nightgown walked across the lawn. We gasped, almost in appreciation. This is one of those things where they're experiencing it almost like a movie, right? She was white-haired and slight, fringed in burning hair, and we could see she was mad, so lost to dreams and furies that the fire around her head seemed almost incidental. No one said a word. In all the heat and noise of detonating wood, she brought a silence to her. How powerful and real, how deep a thing was madness. A fire captain hurried toward her, then circled out slightly disconcerted, as if she were not the person after all he had expected to meet here. She went down in a white burst like a teacup breaking. 4 men were around her now, batting at the flames with helmets and caps. The great work of containing the blaze went on, a labor that seemed as old and lost as cathedral building, the men driven by a spirit of lofty communal craft. A Dalmatian sat in the cab of a hook and ladder truck. This is, fire as a sort of traditional cataclysmic event, right? But then, I want to go down to the last full paragraph on 240, where we get a different kind of fire, a different take on the fire. Soon there was a smell of acrid matter. It could have been insulation burning, polystyrene sheathing for pipes and wires, or one or more of a dozen other substances. A sharp and bitter stink filled the air, overpowering the odor of smoke and charred stone. It changed the mood of the people on the sidewalk. Some put hankies to their faces, others left abruptly in disgust. Whatever caused the odor, I sensed that it made people feel betrayed. An ancient, spacious, and terrible drama was being compromised by something unnatural, some small and nasty intrusion. Our eyes began to burn, the crowd broke up. It was as though we'd been forced to recognize the existence of a second kind of death. One was real, the other synthetic. The odor drove us away, but beneath it, and far worse, was the sense that death came two ways, sometimes at once. And how death entered your mouth and nose, how death smelled, could somehow make a difference to your soul. Seems to me much more critical of contemporary technology and how it sort of changes and destroys the traditional grandeur of fire and death. There's another passage in the book, and I don't think I have it marked, where he imagines Genghis Khan encountering death. Do you remember, or is it Attila the Hun? Maybe it's Attila the Hun. I always think it's Genghis Khan. It's actually Attila the Hun. Can anyone find it for us quickly?
Same sense of awe that people feel, or what Galileo tries to describe it. He describes the cloud with beauty and all that, the verse, all that chemical. And people are overcome by the sight of it.
Yeah, what about it?
I mean, the same thing, the same feeling of being like overwhelmed by an event that. I mean, in the same way that nature operates, but also produced by man, as you said. I mean, technology is...
Yeah, the airborne toxic event itself is a kind of, it's a kind of being overwhelmed by technology that creates a disaster and an evacuation, and the evacuation looks like all those times in history where people are fleeing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like in Europe, I remember that.
I wish I could find this quickly because it's so interesting. He imagines what death was like before things like Nayadin, and I think it's Attila the Hun dying on the plane, and if I could find it, it would just be really useful. I'm sorry I don't have the note written down. Anyway, part of what happens is that he envisions this moment of heroic death, and you know, how he speaks to his underlings as he's dying and so forth. And then he realizes that his idea of it is all taken from the Medes.
Oh, it's page 99, I guess.
Oh, thank you so much. Oh. Yes. Yeah, and Genghis Khan is mentioned in dying, or in the passage. When I read this is about a little less than halfway down page 99. Thank you. When I read obituaries, I almost always note the date of the age of the deceased. And I have to say, I do this too. I think I was doing it before I read the book.
I never read obituaries.
Well, I always look at the list because I want to see if anyone I know has died. When you get older, you'll start doing this because more people that you know will be dying. But it's still pretty rare for me, fortunately. But anyway, I always note the age of the deceased. Automatically, I relate this figure to my own age. 4 years to go, I think. 9 more years. 2 years and I'm dead. The power of numbers is never more evident than when we use them to speculate on the time of our dying. Sometimes I bargain with myself. But would I be willing to accept 65, Genghis Khan's age on dying? I'm 61. I would not be willing to accept 65.
Oh, yes, then.
Suleiman the Magnificent made it to 76. That sounds all right, especially the way I feel now, but how will it sound when I'm 73? It's hard to imagine these men feeling sad about death. Attila the Hun died young. He was still in his 40s. Did he feel sorry for himself? Succumb to self-pity and depression? He was the king of the Huns, the invader of Europe, the scourge of God. I want to believe he lay in his tent wrapped in animal skins, as in some internationally financed movie epic, and said brave, cruel things to his aides and retainers. no weakening of the spirit, no sense of the irony of human existence, that we are the highest form of life on earth and yet ineffably sad because we know what no other animal knows, that we must die. Attila did not look through the opening in his tent and gesture at some lame dog standing at the edge of the fire waiting to be thrown a scrap of meat. He did not say, that pathetic flea-ridden beast is better off than the greatest ruler of men. It doesn't know what we know. It doesn't feel what we feel. It can't be sad as we are sad. I want to believe he was not afraid. He accepted death as an experience that flows naturally from life, a wild ride through the forest as would befit someone known as the scourge of God. Cutting off their hair and disfiguring their own faces in barbarian tribute as the camera pulls back out of the tent and pans across the night sky of the 5th century AD, clear and uncontaminated, bright banded with shimmering worlds. There's this notion of heroic death, right? But when Jack begins to confront his own death, he is no Attila the Hun. Well, when we come back, part of what I want to argue is that the whole anxiety about death in this text has to do with death in the absence of meta-narratives. One of the great functions of meta-narratives is that they give meaning to death. This is clear in religion.
And that's what explains the conversation with the nun in the end.
Yeah, but it's clear in religion. But even if you think about something like the Bolshevik Revolution, you know, those who died in the revolution believed that they were dying in the name of a historical movement toward a utopia, right? The meta-narrative gave a meaning to the death. Meta-narratives in wars explain why people have not died in vain, supposedly.
Martyrs.
Right? Huh?
They become martyrs.
They make them martyrs. Jack is somebody who is facing death without meta-narratives, and he has no consolation in his fear. And when we resume, I think maybe we might resume by looking at the conversation that he has with Murray, in which he gets the idea of killing Willie Mink as a way of defending himself against death. And that is on
286.
It's around 286. Actually, it begins a little earlier than that. It's chapter 37, beginning on 282. Anything else before we break for lunch? Okay. See you at 2 o'clock.